Bonjour Morad.
Salut Arthur, ça va?
Oui, ça va et toi?
Ouais, ça va.
Morad Montazami, you are independent art researcher, publisher, and curator based in Paris. You are director of the platform Zamân Books Curating, which aims to develop and support transnational studies of Arab, Asian, and African modernities. Zamân Books Curating published books such as Hamid Abdallah, Arab Décédé in 2018, and préface à un livre pour un musée syrien in 2020. Among many of your projects, you created the exhibition called Bagdad Mon Amour at the Institut des Cultures de l'Islam in Paris in 2018. And in 2019, you created the exhibition called New Waves, Mohamed Melehi and the Casablanca Art School at the Mosaic Rooms in London and in Makal in Marrakesh. And then the exhibition was held at Al Circle Foundation in Dubai in 2020. So I invited you to this conversation to talk about your research on modern Moroccan art, and more specifically the Casablanca Art School in the 60s. And I'd like to thank you a lot for providing us amazing archival images from Mohamed Melehi archives that we will be discussing in this panel. So Morocco was under French protectorate from 1912 to 1956. At that time, how the teaching of plastic arts looked like in Morocco?
Well, thank you very much, Arthur, for your very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be with you in this program, and definitely as in dialogue with the Dalloul Art Foundation, which is, of course, a landmark for Arab modernities and international art. Your first question is pretty relevant in the sense that we often tend to think of the Casablanca Art School as almost an ex nihilo phenomenon, and rightly for the fact that the previous history of the Casablanca Art School, which means before the arrival of protagonists such as Belkahia, Chebaa, and Melehi, and basically before the very independence of Morocco, and even, as you rightly pointed, since the very beginning of the 20th century, is not so much documented. So to put it in context, I could say that the French protectorate and mandate in Morocco regarding the arts and culture in general gave way to the kind of emblematic for colonial history exportation of the École des Beaux-Arts model, or exportation of the dispositif or the device that a fine art school inspired by the French could be put in place. So actually what's interesting is probably the difference between other French colonies in Asia, for example, where the fine art schools exported by the French were mainly directed towards local population in order to raise a certain artistic ability and pedagogy, but obviously driven by a colonial and also pretty much, you could say, pre-modern in a way, or pre-avant-garde, which is of course more conservative and more canonical.
Yeah.
And the difference would be that in the Moroccan protectorate, the exportation of the fine art school à la française wasn't exactly driven by the pedagogic or local population education. It was actually at first and generally more driven by the study and the preservation somehow of the Moroccan traditional craft,
Yeah.
And therefore, the way French art schools were implemented in Morocco, or French protectorate implemented a lot of museums, actually, in comparison to fine art school, which were not that many. There was one in Casablanca run by the French, and there was another one in Tétouan, the Tétouan Art Institute, but run by the Spanish, because Morocco was divided between the French protectorate and the Spanish protectorate. But beside those art schools, it was also a greater number of museums that the French established in Morocco between the beginning of the 20th century and independence, which is several arts and crafts museums and traditional and local art, but obviously with also, again, a colonial agenda, and not so much integrating local population, and especially the youth, to a proper pedagogic process, which will happen progressively, at the Casablanca Art School through the 40s and 50s. It will come to a point of developing in a more grassroots, and also integrating already some Moroccan students, not only French students, because obviously between 1910s and 1940s, there are much more, not to say only French students, but Moroccan students would be integrated slightly before let's say the post-independence revolution that will happen at the school from 1962 with Farid Belkahia's arrival as a director. So what it looked like, or what it felt like before the arrival of these key and kind of revolutionary protagonists, was somehow a mix, a kind of impure mix, you could say, of a French-inspired École des Beaux-Arts, but also very much implemented for the study and the display or the preservation of traditional arts and craft by the French vision and by the French museology, if you want. And then progressively, again, through the 50s and beginning 60s, it tended to function much more as a way of a proper art school, or what you could expect from a traditional École des Beaux-Arts.
Yeah. Can you tell us what do we call the Group of Casablanca, and how did it form?
Well, the Group of Casablanca, it's as you know, of course, it's a very wide and also polymorphous histories and narratives around it. Working around those archives and histories for several years now, throughout different projects that I was privileged to collaborate, and often collectively with other colleagues that I should mention, such as Salma Lahlou, Maud Housset, or Fatima Zahra Lakrissa, who are all very talented and remarkable Moroccan art historians and researchers who collaborate with me on the anticipated first official publication about the Casablanca Art School archives, which we wish to publish soon, was basically to try to give a sense of concentric circles for this matter, which is basically a core group. And let's say the core group can be defined either as the trio, which were Belkahia, Chebaa, and Melehi. And of course, for the time being, it's quite incredible because we were able to put up this international circulation of the New Waves Melehi, retrospective recently. I, of course, with an extremely sad conclusion of Mr. Melehi, who passed away, in last October after this circulation of this exhibition, and made it something, more than existential for me. Like Mr. Melehi is probably someone who contributed the most to who I am as a curator today by giving me his trust and giving me the right to curate his historical work as I did. And then the trio, considered as a core group, can also be extended, as we will discuss with you a bit later, by the three other artists who are Romain Attallah, Mustafa Hafid, and Mohamed Hamidi, who will also become art professors at the Casablanca Art School between end of 60s, beginning 70s, but especially will join the trio in the famous street exhibitions that we will discuss. And then that kind of core group of the three or six artists gathered for the plastic presence exhibitions and street manifestos will connect with other protagonists from the local Moroccan avant-garde, which can be differently considered as Casablanca Art School companions or Casablanca Art School fellow artists and activists, such as one that we see right here in a very funny conversation with Belkahia, who is Miloud Labied. Miloud Labied was a very important protagonist, or such as Hossein Miloudi, or such as Fouad Belamin, or such as Malika Ageznai, or such as Mohamed Qatas. All of these different artists contributed and participated alongside the core group to different manifestations, exhibitions, platforms, struggles, artistic and cultural struggles throughout the 70s, probably with the epitome of the Asila Art Festival, where they all gather in order to act as collectively as possible. So I would say you have to consider a core group, and then you have to consider those constellations or concentric circles that include a wider group of people, among whom some were ex-students and some were not ex-students, but basically fellow artists and activists. And I'm sure we can mention more of them in the meantime.
You talked about this trio. Can you introduce us to these three members of the trio? Starting with Farid Belkahia.
Of course, so Farid Belkahia, quite known nowadays. I was speaking about the incredible moment we're in for this trio, because after the New Waves exhibition that we co-produced with Mosaic Rooms, Makal, and Al Serkal, we're privileged, not done by me, but privileged as audience to have a Farid Belkahia retrospective now in place in Centre Pompidou. Of course, with closed doors, but I hope will be open, from what I heard, next month, probably even before the end of May. Maybe French Museum will reopen, but the catalog of this exhibition was published and is great. So as far as Farid Belkahia is concerned, I would say that he's a key figure who took the direction of the Casablanca Art School at a very early age. He was not even 25 years old, I think, when he was hired as a very young director of the school. But Farid Belkahia was basically an artist with a tremendous experience at the Paris Fine Art School, École des Beaux-Arts de Paris, where he studied in the second half of the 50s. And he was not the only one, of course. There were already Jilali Gharbawi and Ahmed Sharkawi, who had also some connections with the Paris Fine Art School, and French artists such as Roger Bissière and other protagonists of the École de Paris, who were very important to Belkahia's formation at that time, even though he didn't stop his spectrum of influence with École de Paris, but he also traveled to Prague, actually after Paris, where he was also able to connect with a whole network of leftists and communists, artists and poets, such as Pablo Neruda or Elsa Triolet or Louis Aragon. who Belkahia met in Prague. So definitely, you know, this embodiment of a cosmopolitan artist who also will, from 1962 and even beyond, get more in depth with local and Moroccan and national artistic matters, and of course probably one of the first artists to have stand extremely strongly for alternative materials, and the alternative materials such as the copper and obviously animal skin, as we see here, because you have to consider copper and animal skin as very popular, very grassroots technique, and even ecosystem in a way, because each material or technique respond to an ecosystem driven by a certain climate, even in Morocco, and also by the craftsmen and artisan tradition, efforts, and knowledge, which will be one of the main, of course, point of the Casablanca Art School and Belkahia, is to kind of revisit and reinvest in that crossings between a fine artist and a craftsman.
Yeah. The second artist that you mentioned is Mohamed Chebaa. Again, can you introduce us to this artist and his works? That we have here two examples.
Yeah, it's incredible also given that we have the chance to speak with you, as you are also sitting with great artworks. I was talking about this very exciting cycle of exhibitions because we were blessed to co-produce a solo exhibition of Mohamed Chebaa. You fairly consider as a retrospective, and his first retrospective outside of Morocco, and certainly after his death. So Mohamed Chebaa really deserved a better representation, and I'm also so happy that in this exhibition at the Cultural Foundation in Abu Dhabi for this retrospective of Chebaa, the Dalloul Art Foundation also, you know, included and lended key artwork. So I would recommend for everyone to check online the cultural exhibition Mohamed Chebaa. Visual Consciousness is the title of the exhibition, and explains well the character of Mohamed Chebaa, who was definitely not only, but also the kind of theoretician, the kind of, not the only mind, because you also had Tony Maraini, the Italian anthropologist and art historian who was the Mohamed Melehi's partner and a key activist and writer of the Casablanca Art School manifestos. But Mohamed Chebaa was on the forefront to everything related to art theory, pedagogy, writing, and, you know, implementing real principles. He was someone who didn't really made it to France. France, Paris was not so much in his spectrum, you know, for his early years, definitely more driven by Italy. And the few years he stayed in Italy at the end of the 50s, actually alongside Melehi and Chebaa and Atalla spent time all together in Italy at the end of the 50s, before Melehi travels to the US. But probably Chebaa can be considered as, you know, the most grassroots and also kind of encompassing figure of art theory and practice for the local ground, because even beyond his role at the Casablanca Art School, you know, in that very revolutionary parenthesis of, you know, second half of 60s, he then became an art teacher and also a director of different art schools in Morocco until the end of his life. So like he taught and for a very long time at the École d'Architecture in Casablanca, and also around 1993 he became the director of the Tétouan Fine Art School for many years. So Mohamed Chebaa, you know, definitely someone also fighting for experimental art, and I think he was something that characterizes him even beyond Belkahia and Melehi, is that he was taking the issue of experimentation as something highly serious, as an aesthetic risk, and also as a national collective pride, for the ability of experimenting the arts more than imposing an aesthetic, or more than closing the debate around certain principle. He
Yeah.
basically embodied that kind of endless experiment and endless evolution of forms related to firm principles and strong principles, but in an incredible fluidity and transformational value of forms. So that's why when you look at Melehi or Belkahia, you have kind of regular patterns structuring the works almost all along their life. But when you look at Chebaa, you see constant change, constant shifts of patterns, constant shifting and mixing of his own patterns into new patterns. So to me, he's almost algorithmic. He's almost algorithmic, and there's something almost computer-like. Actually, he will get interest in computer-driven forms and arabesque during the 80s. He will have an interest for that. But for me, he has that particularity when you look at his work, since the 50s until the 2000s.
Yeah. And then we have here the works of Mohamed Melehi, and between 1962 and 1964, Mohamed Melehi lived in the US, and in 1964 he returned to Morocco. Here we have two works which correspond to two different stages of his earth, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. What can I say about Melehi? Because I consider him as my ustad, my master, and really all praise to him. Rest in peace. It's always different for me to talk about him than talking about the others. It's great that you compared those two works from different times. Indeed, it also shows more variety than what people could expect when they have a broad or superficial way of Melehi, which is basically waves everywhere, and which is not wrong. There are kind of waves everywhere and all the time, but it's obviously much more subtle than that. And the American kind of hard edge inspired works, as the one on the left, is emblematic of his time in New York, but also facing issues like computer technology again at an earlier stage, than Chebaa. But then Chebaa took it somewhere else, I would say. Whereas Melehi experienced that kind of confrontation to technology, speed, industrial speed and communication speed, and all the different theories that he absorbed in New York. One of the most important ones was the cybernetics theory that he was very influenced by. And again, the painting on the left, shows this kind of almost monochrome plain surface, giving light to a certain ornamented structure or pattern, which are these little squares that can be either referred to as some of the electronic card that existed at that time, where you had some cards with holes in it that were generated by computers in a kind of prehistory of our big data world, but also generally reflecting the skyscrapers, the kind of flashing lights of windows in New York skyscrapers turning on and off for the urban landscape, and the kind of vertigo that Melehi was experiencing with New York buildings. And the work on the right is obviously from the beginning of the 80s, which is very interesting, but because it's also correspond to the intensity of the Asila festival ongoing since 78, and which is also when some of his wave patterns from the 70s will be reoriented in a bit more landscape-ish direction, even some of them including moonlight and kind of abstract landscape of Asila, or symbolically of Asila in the north of Morocco. But also with this particular work that you showed here, an extremely rare kind of hurufiyya gesture for a very obvious and overt scripture and writing that we see on the top of the painting, which is extremely rare. Like, he didn't include many explicit or legible calligraphy. 99% of the time, the wave itself stands for a generator of circular forms, or shifting forms, or bending forms that themselves contain the dynamic that you have when you do calligraphy with your hand, or when you try to grasp the calligraphic organization of the ornaments on the vault of a mosque, and the wave was always sufficient for itself. But it's very interesting also that he was, let's say, dynamic and diverse and free enough to sometimes go against his own principle and also go back to more traditional writings and hurufiyya gestures.
Between 1964 and 1969, ateliers and collective exhibitions happened. And can we see the change in the student artworks at that time, resulting from the new program of the pedagogical team in the Casablanca Art School?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly an amount of changes to be witnessed from the students' artworks, but it's exactly the shift from working on easel painting, because all of these students were still working mainly on easel painting, which, easel painting is not only a historical and Western foundation of in a certain modernism, but it's also, I would say, like Michel Foucault was saying, I'm sorry if maybe it will sound a bit exaggerated, but I don't think so, when he spoke about the school or the prison or the hospital as a dispositif, that you say in English, you would call it a device or an apparel. And I think easel painting, le chevalet, has to do with a certain education, not only of your artistic skills, but of your body. It's a certain way of standing, it's a certain way of keeping the brush, and it's a certain way of standing with the canvas. It's a whole physical, ethical education beyond artistic. And that has to do with the Western, not only colonial, but also colonial, because it was the way the French and the Spanish thought they could raise Moroccan artists, if you want. So obviously, the main breakup and the main rupture is not a small one. It's with easel painting, but with easel painting in the broad sense, in the sense that when you break up from easel painting, you don't only break from painting on an easel, or painting on the floor, or painting on the wall, or mounting your canvas before painting, or not mounting it. it's a general experimentation with the school studios and with the students that will make some profound changes. So again, one of them is the shift after easel painting, or how to create after that. And the images that you showed of Melehi's studio also show that they basically got out of the school studios. They were trying to have the students work even in a different environment, which is to take them out from some of the rooms of the school and go in the exterior, or also to have more collaborative process, and also one of the very important thing for them, not only to bring the students to work in more experimental ways and between the medias, and to learn for themselves how to approach graphic design, which was actually not even taught at the school before the 60s. It was only, I guess, a very important for them to ask the students to have responsibility in the displays, which means that the students were not only required to create their work and develop their own path or their own framework by taking bits of elements from the different studios of Melehi, Chebaa, Tony, etc. But it was also about getting them working collectively on how they will display their own works, which we will see a bit later. But the image that we see now is also a very good example, of course. I understand why you're showing it, because it's the Form and Symbol exhibition of 1967, which was not a student exhibition, but happened in the space where the students had their annual or trimester display and exhibitions. That one was put up by Mohamed Melehi with the obvious collaboration of Bert Flint, because what you see in this Form and Symbol exhibition happening in this gallery of the Arab League Park, which was basically had become the Casablanca Fine Art School exhibition space, is a popular art display. And the popular art display is quite experimental. Why is it experimental? Because if you look carefully on the overall view, you will see that the carpets are hung like paintings.
Yeah.
So in a way, paintings have been replaced by carpets, which is a kind of upgrade of Melehi's gesture with the unique carpet of his 65 exhibition. But you also have something incredibly exciting, which is Amazigh and Berber jewels, not only in real, but also reproduced on augmented and blow-up photograph of these jewels. So Melehi, by photography and by printing those images or resizing them, literally creates an experimental scenography that will be, very much important to the thinking of the group, which is art is not only artworks, but art is also a way of installing things, and the way of installing things translate a sense of collectivity and community, and also the border between what's apparently modern and apparently traditional has also been exquisitely exploded.
Yeah,